thank you all for coming this evening, and assalamu alaikum to you all. Now, welcome to the House of Lords for tonight's City Circle lecture, and thank you particularly to Baroness Berridge, who has kindly not only inspired the seminar for tonight, but sponsored us so that we can make use of this venue. If I could first introduce each of our speakers, and then I'll speak briefly on City Circle before we commence with the seminar this evening. Baroness Berridge is a British Conservative politician and a member of the House of Lords. Now, since 2012, Baroness Berridge has become a key voice in freedom of religion and belief as defined under Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. She started and currently serves as co-chair of the All-Parliamentary Party on International Religious Freedom, where she leads the discussion on this deepening worldwide issue. Following on from Baroness Berridge, and to my far left is Grant Howell, partner at Charles Russell Speechlys. Now, he is a specialist in family lawyer and recognised individual in the legal directories. He has qualified not only as a family arbitrator but also a collaborative lawyer. And it is in his role as head of the Middle East family practice that he has dealt with many issues, raising some of the matters that we will be discussing this evening. He's also a fellow of the International Academy of Family Lawyers. To my far right, Dr. Samia Bana will be the third panellist speaking, and she's a senior lecturer in law and joined SOAS in September 2013. Now, her research interests include, among other things, the practice of Muslim family law in the UK and Europe. And her principal area of research is Muslim women, having authored the Muslim Women and Sharia Councils, Transcending the Boundaries of Community and Law text. Now, she's also completed a research project with the Ministry of Justice entitled An Exploratory Study of Sharia Councils in England with respect to family law. And following on from Samia will be Sir Mark Headley, who is sitting on my second to the right. Now, Sir Mark is a British judge of the High Court of England and Wales, and he was recently appointed as one of the panel members for the Home Office Sharia Review. After studying at the University of Liverpool, he was called to the bar at Gray's Inn, and he practiced as a barrister before being appointed as a recorder, a circuit judge, and then became a High Court judge in 2001. He's described as the epitome of a modern judge in touch with society and its issues. Now, following on from Sir Mark will be Nusrat Ghani MP on my second to the far left. After working in the charity sector and later working for the BBC World Service, Nusrat embarked on her political career in 2010 when she became the first Muslim woman to be elected as a British Conservative Member of Parliament. Nusrat represents Wealdon in East Sussex and is appointed to the Home Affairs Select Committee Sharia Review panel. Now, unfortunately, Ms. Ghani will have to leave a tad early, so it might be that we're hearing from the Home Affairs Select Committee Review panel a little earlier. Now, finally, we have Shaista Gohir OBE, who's sitting third from my left. And I'm grateful to her for attending, as she's chair of the Muslim Women's Network UK and joined us late to this panel to help provide the audience tonight an insight of the frontline issues facing Muslim women, particularly where there are issues of Muslim marriage and divorce. Shaista is known for her firebrand element of Muslim feminism, and is, in her own words, and I quote this, "Feminism is the light in the darkness of patriarchy," and I think that defines much of the work that Shaista has done. In particular, she authored a text early this year on Muslim marriage and divorce, which I would highly recommend to anybody who would like further details of the issues that will be raised tonight. Just a few housekeeping matters. If anybody has any mobiles, please switch these off. We have a Twitter hashtag CC Talks, and our members do actively tweet during events, so if you have anything to add, please do. And please be mindful when speaking this evening, because we are recording this lecture, as we do all the lectures. Our lectures are normally made available on the City Circle website, so please keep this in mind. Now, for anybody who would like, I can see many new faces, I'm going to sort of give a quick summary of City Circle as a charity before we move on to the seminar. Now, City Circle provides 3 different projects, and the one that you're here for tonight are 3 Friday lectures. Now, these were really the inspiration behind the founding of City Circle. We have over 4,000 members, and it's a community where individuals, particularly members of the ethnic minority community, are provided with space to critically discuss and debate issues of concern. Now, it's been integral in bringing together Muslim and non-Muslim views, but also encouraging interfaith and intergenerational dialogue. Now, all our talks are open to members and non-members alike, but for anybody who would like to be informed of future talks, please do subscribe to our mailing list. In addition to that, we have a Saturday school and Sunday evening Helping the Homeless project. Now, I bring all these three projects to your attention because City Circle is obviously much more than these public lectures. And if anybody would like to assist with either volunteering or donating, please do ask the members of City Circle for details when we finish tonight. The volunteers will have the City Circle logo on their tag, so please keep an eye out for that. Now, starting on now with the seminar for this evening, Religious Freedom in Family Law. If I could please hand over now to Baroness Berridge to go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me this evening. This is a very tall lecture, it must be called Men Only. I think I stand to one side. I am Liz Raghani. I sit on the Home Affairs Select Committee. I am the MP for Wilden in East Sussex. The Home Affairs Select Committee conducts many inquiries and reviews. This weekend we published our anti-Semitism inquiry, you might have come across that. We published the terrorism inquiry recently, and at the moment we're undertaking 10 inquiries, and one that's taking up most of our time is historic child sexual abuse. I joined the committee a year and a half ago. It is made up of a cross-party parliamentarians, and you're voted on by MPs, and it's very rare that new MPs get voted on, so I was very pleased to be elected over a year ago, and I was quite keen to cover themes which impact people's lives in urban and rural areas. We had taken some anecdotal evidence on the impact of Sharia Councils, and I was quite keen for the committee to undertake a wide inquiry on the role of Sharia Councils, not only in the UK, but Europe and also overseas. And one of the pleasures of being on the Home Affairs Select Committee means that you can invite the Secretary of State to give evidence 4 times a year. And previously the Secretary of State was Theresa May, and each time that she appeared, I would challenge her on the issue of Sharia Councils in the UK, when the government was going to conduct an inquiry on what we thought the role of Sharia Councils were in modern Britain. At the penultimate session, I believe, I'm looking at my clerk, Adrian, who is the brains behind the Select Committee, but I believe her penultimate session, she did put in place an inquiry with the Home Office, which we have Sir Headley talking about later on today. We were quite keen within the Home Affairs Select Committee to hold our inquiry before the Home Office inquiry publishes, because we are a little bit nervous about the parameters of the Home Office inquiry. If you go onto the Home Affairs Select Committee website, you can submit evidence. Anybody can submit evidence to our inquiry. The actual inquiry session takes place on the 1st of November. It is a public session in the House of Commons. Anybody can come along and attend. And we are putting together a list of people that we want to come forward with the evidence, not just from the UK, but from overseas as well. We are hoping to publish our inquiry by the end of the year or very early in January. If the evidence is overwhelming in any direction, we might open up another evidence session and have more people come forward. When you're dealing with issues of Sharia Councils, any faith-based issues that involve women, and especially vulnerable women, it is incredibly difficult to get women to come forward with new evidence. And one of the things that we have noticed within this inquiry is even though we can get experts to come forward, NGOs to come forward, we cannot get women to come forward and give evidence in a public session. So we are trying to work out how we can overcome that without actually putting a spotlight on any particular community in the UK. The committee is concerned that people might review this inquiry as an attack on a particular faith group or a particular community, which isn't the case. We have heard anecdotal evidence, and evidence has been submitted that on occasions women are in particular given advice to manage their lives with contrary to the British rule of law. And the fact remains that we do not know how many Sharia Councils exist in the UK today and what ways that they work within our communities. So first of all, we need to get the evidence to show us how many exist, how they work, where they work, on what sort of people go forward, where they work well, and where they are contradicting the rule of law. So those are the parameters of the inquiry. I'm not sure what more to add, or whether it would be easy for me to take questions now, because I need to leave at 6:20. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. You have at least 3 to 5 minutes.
Sorry, you mentioned there's an open meeting that we can all attend. Can you
On the 2nd of November?
Yes.
the inquiry will take place. Every inquiry that we hold is an open meeting, so you need to make your way over to Portcullis House and the appropriate room. It will be advertised on the Home Affairs Select Committee website. People probably just haven't booked the room yet. And the inquiry on the 1st of November, we believe that everybody that wants to give evidence is happy for it to be in a public space. It's always televised, I think, on the parliamentary channel. And because of the nature of it, just like the nature of many of our other committees, it tends to be trailed on the news as well. But you make your way to Portcullis House, you can sit at the back of the room. You can't intervene or interject at any point. But between now and then, you can submit evidence. And you just submit evidence by sending an email to the Home Affairs website. Aidan, can I go through the portal, or do they send it to you directly?
If they email it to us.
Yeah, so there's an email address, Home Affairs something, parliament.co.uk, and we accept all evidence and we review all evidence, and it's all noted in the back of our report.
Thank you.
Just one quick thought. So Cousin Ben, I run the All Party Group about female abolition relief, and just would love to talk more with your colleague and yourself later at some point. Thank you. Just specifically about the terms of the inquiry, I noticed just from my own studies looking at the compatibility of Islamic law with freedom of religion, belief, women's rights, etc. Some of the terms of reference, and it's a question I'd like to get experts' opinion as well, whether terms of reference asking the basic tenets of Sharia law on divorce and family law, and basically whether Sharia law is kind of judging whether it's good or not. Just wondering whether that's, because Sharia law is a huge body of opinions and understanding, and just whether that is quite a difficult question to answer, and whether it's going to be, it might have a negative impact by asking that rather than the practices of the individuals running the councils.
This is an issue because we have some overwhelming evidence on either side of that argument, so we don't want this committee to be about Sharia, Islamic faith and how it's interpreted in the UK, because we will just spend for this inquiry. What we really want this inquiry to be about is women who go forward to Sharia Councils if they don't know that there is any other avenue to reach to get SACA or get some advice. If they end up at the Sharia Council, what ends up being their path, and where do they go? How do they live their lives? Are they being told that there are other services available to them? We've had some anecdotal evidence that a particular police force, when they came across a domestic violence victim, suggested that she goes forward to a Sharia Council. And we've had some other evidence from women when they've been involved in situations that are difficult within their home, that are being encouraged to go to Sharia Council. People in the public services who should know better. And we just want to have a better understanding how widespread that is. I think outside of our inquiry, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee inquiry has undertaken a report on political Islam, which covered that issue in a little bit of...
We also submitted to that, we're concerned about some of the things.
Well, that hasn't published yet. I think once that is published, then we at some point might go back and review this, but we don't want this to be a review on the Islamic faith.
Definitions and,
yes.
And it's a very broad thing you're looking at, obviously.
Ours is quite broad because the Home Office inquiry, we would argue, was quite broad, and we wanted to see what evidence came forward and then we would narrow it down. As you know, the Home Affairs Select Committee has been in the papers not just for our inquiries but the movement amongst our chairs, so it's taken away some time where we could have spent doing this. So we're just going to push it, we've had to move it across from the summer to November, but we're hoping that once we meet up the next couple of weeks we can review the evidence, have the first session in November and see how long it might take us to collect further evidence or produce a report. It's 6:21, I do have to go, so I'm so sorry. But Adrian is here and he'll be taking notes and obviously be observing any questions that you might want to ask. Thank you. Thank you.
Podium. Good evening everyone. It's a privilege to be able to host you here this evening and welcome you to this event. I'm also going to be the timekeeper for this evening, so I better make a good start and not go over 8 minutes myself. Just a couple of things to say. Please, do take the message from Mr. to heart that what we're doing here in terms of select committees is not mysterious because we're within this palace. These are public hearings and evidence can be submitted from any interested person or interested group. And we're here to serve you. So the more that you make your views known, the better our inquiries are. We depend on the engagement of people in terms of them giving evidence to our committees. But I also do want to emphasise the point that was also made when I served on the Joint Committee for Human Rights for a number of years. We did try and investigate or to see whether to do an inquiry into the rights of women in religious communities in the UK. Because when we had a thematic evidence session day, we had women's groups from all kinds of different faith communities come forward, and we were surprised, that this was an issue that wasn't particular to one faith community, and we had some really interesting evidence from a charity that did about domestic violence and the Christian theology. I'm a Christian, and how Christian theology can be used to justify domestic violence. So I think it was really eye-opening to us. Unfortunately, we didn't find the time within our committee schedule to do that. But my main role here in Parliament, one of the things I do is I co-chair the group, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Freedom of Religion or Belief. So I was given a very short title that is probably a degree course, which is How is Religious Freedom Protected in International Law? And to be brief about it, as I say, that's a degree course in and of itself, it's the protection for your religious freedoms in international law is not as strong as it is for many other human rights. The founding document in our human rights laws, many of you will know, was the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that was founded, it's more of a political statement rather than a legal statement, and this was just after the end of the First World War. So that's the context in which we were operating then. And Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does actually give what still remains the best outline of what religious freedom in international law means. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, in public or in private, to manifest that religion or belief in practice, worship and observance. That remains more of a political statement. It does now form part of what we call customary international law, which I think is a bit akin to sort of common law. It's kind of you're so used to it that it actually has become enforceable. That was followed by Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which outlines that right in very similar terms. Now, the thing about these international treaties, and we've obviously had a lot of talk about something called Article 50 at the moment, is that unless states ratify this, unless that declaration it went into a convention, but unless you have a convention on a specific human right, it's very difficult for you or a member of the public to see those rights that are enshrined in international law enforceable in your day-to-day life. Many of the rights, though, from the Universal Declaration have then been made the subject of a convention. So you'll have a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women, something called CEDAW. There's a convention on the rights of the child. There's a convention on eliminating torture. So most of those big, lofty political phrases from the Universal Declaration found their way into a convention. Then states ratify that, sign up to it, and ratify it. And I can't believe I'm standing here doing this with a SOAS law lecturer here, but that, in broad terms, means that not only is the UK bound in international law by these conventions, it then becomes applicable in UK law. So, for instance, we've just passed an Act of Parliament about cultural property. That was basically based on something called the Hague Convention, which is about sort of monuments, men and women. The property that gets destroyed by groups in warfare, and about the protection of that. Without the Act of Parliament, that convention wasn't part of UK law. So until we put it into UK law, we're now bound by it internationally, and it is now part of UK law. In terms of what's more relevant for our context here, we have the unusual situation with the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, before that was part of our domestic law through the Human Rights Act, it was an unusual convention because it had a court. There's very few of these international conventions where there's a court. You might have heard of the International Criminal Court that tries war crimes. So you had a European-wide convention that then had a court. And as I was growing up, I used to hear these rare cases where someone had taken an individual petition to the European Court on Human Rights and had the case adjudicated there. Of course, post the Human Rights Act, you could now take your convention rights into the UK courts, directly enforceable. Prior to that, the courts would take the European jurisprudence into account in court in cases, but it gave you the right. So all of those articles in the European Convention became enforceable through the UK courts. And Article 9 of the European Convention, which covers religious freedom, then became part of the UK law. So your religious freedoms are answering that question for you about how is religious freedom protected under international law. It is, but in terms of what protections you get as an individual, it's really within the European jurisprudence where you can see that there has been directly enforceable rights that you have here in the UK courts, and then you can still appeal right back to Strasbourg to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, you may have heard of some of the cases. There were a number of cases recently from the UK in relation to religious freedom that went to the European Court on Human Rights, cases to do with the wearing of the cross by the British Airways employee. To be very, very broad brush about the situation for religious freedom, if you go to the European Court on Human Rights, they are reluctant to interfere in national law and national practice and culture around religion, around freedom of religion or belief. They give what's called in legal terms a very big margin of appreciation. That just means the freedom that's given to each particular nation in Europe to make their own decisions in relation to this matter. So the whole thing to do with the burqas in France, they refused to interfere with that decision by the French national legislature. So when you're looking at religious freedom, you have this absolute right to believe what you want to believe and to choose to change that belief in international law. It's only when it comes to the manifestation and the practice of your religious freedom that your nation state is allowed to make different laws that can circumscribe your religious freedom, but it's under very strict criteria. And you can't actually suspend people's religious freedom even in a state of emergency. That's not one of the caveats to restricting religious freedom. And it's those cases that end up going through the courts, and those cases when someone's restricting your freedom of religion or belief, that you can take, the practice of it, that you can take to the UK courts. There are huge problems in relation to the enforcement of freedom of religion or belief. And there are also very foundational problems, particularly in the fact that international law was basically brought about at a time when the main violator of your rights was a nation state. Now, IS and other groups, we are now living in the realm of third-party actors, that's what we now call them, who are interfering with people's freedoms. And so because the UK had waited, I think since the Hague Convention on Cultural Property was 1954 or 58, if my memory is serving me correctly, because we had waited so long to bring it into UK law, it actually didn't cover the situation in Syria and Iraq because it only covers nation states. So that's the irony of the situation. It is an offence under UK law because of sanctions, because of Security Council resolution. But under that convention that was designed to protect cultural property, it only really operated in the context of a state in a warfare, in declared conflict, destroying cultural property or religious heritage, not if third-party actors are doing it. So we do have these very big problems in international law in relation to the enforcement of freedom of religion or belief. So that's the very big framework. Will we ever begin again the process of trying to get a convention on this matter? Well, there are suggestions around that, but you've got to get the political consensus around what do you mean by freedom of religion or belief, what do you mean by people's right to manifest that belief, and then of course it impacts lots of other freedoms such as the right to educate your children in the faith of your choice. So we are having, I think, in the field of freedom of religion and belief, and you've seen so many of the violations on your TV screens at the moment, looking for sort of non-legal and more practical, innovative solutions to try and help people who are suffering grave violations on the ground. So I don't think the Rohingya Muslims in Burma have ever heard of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So how is it that we try and deal with the situation of one of the most persecuted people groups on the face of the planet, when actually the legal infrastructure is not, they cannot petition and they cannot go from grassroots. This highlights as well quite a big problem that UN, I hope, in the next Secretary General faces, which you've got, even as a parliamentarian, and you deal with all these big principles in international law, there's a huge gulf called enforcement between what the UN is saying and doing there and what you actually practically are experiencing even as a parliamentarian here. That's why they've introduced some of the special rapporteurs to kind of fill that enforcement gap. So there's great information. The special rapporteurs do a really, really great job fact-finding. They go in country, they do these great reports. And as the previous special rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief said to me, that it's all about, you're all about the enforcement, Elizabeth. That's the gap that we've got. So I'm hoping to see change in that area. We'd love to have you at Freedom. Our website's called freedomdeclared.org. On our website, and Catherine has just asked a question, who helps us run that group, you'll find, I think it's the only portal where you will find stories of persecution of humanists, of Muslims, of Christians, of Buddhists, of Hindus. We are approaching this as a human right. So please, do sign up to our website as well if you're interested in hearing and being able to be involved in helping people who are persecuted for their faith or belief. I think that is 7 minutes. Is it 8 minutes? Sorry. So I am now going to be the timekeeper, but it's wonderful to have you here this evening. Thank you.
If I can now invite Grant Howell, partner at Charles Russell Speech, please, to address you.
Thank you, Shabana. As mentioned in Shabana's introduction, I'm an English lawyer, but my firm has 2 offices in the Gulf, and for many years we've dealt with many cases that have, if you like, an Islamic element, which is where I come into this. And the idea, having had the broad picture from Baroness Berwick, is to give some detail as to English law very briefly and limit it to matrimonial law. It's important to do this, I think, because I'm sure, obviously many of you will know many of the things I'm going to say, but this is an area where there are certain myths that are perpetuated, and therefore I think it's important to kind of set the discussion we're going to have, if you like, the framework in place. Okay, I'm sure you won't be able to see that from the back, but these slides will be made available, I assume, on the City Circle website. The whole purpose here was just to contrast civil marriage in England, Jewish marriage and Islamic marriage in the context of a divorce. And it sets out the various stages. I won't go through them now. I'll pick up some points. The key points, I suppose, from this are the interrelation between the two. And in particular, in relation to the Jewish marriage, there is the ability under English law to block the English divorce unless there is a Jewish religious divorce. That ability is not there in Islamic marriage. We can talk about that a bit later if you wish. And the differences, as I set out on there, but again, I won't take time with it now, but you'll see that on the slides. So, what I want to deal with really is 2 main aspects, and then go on to a brief conclusion. Comparing the treatment of religions, as has been mentioned, and obviously, free to practice religion under English law, of course, free to marry according to religion, but, ... And of course, it's a big but, because I'm sure you all know, if you marry in a Church of England establishment, Church of Wales, if you're a Quaker, if you're Jewish, then the marriage you have will be recognised under English law. However, if you marry in a mosque, subject to what I'm about to say, which again I'm sure you know, then it will not be recognised unless you have a civil marriage, and that's the difference. Marriage has to be monogamous, which may differ from certain other religions as well. You can, of course, register a place of worship for authorised marriage, and that can be whatever place of worship you wish to view. The Law Commission did a report, and in July 2015, the official figures were that only 22% of mosques were registered, for example, to carry out an English civil marriage. And indeed, in only 13% of them was the imam alone able to carry out the marriage, again because of registration. So that led, in that year, that led to 200 marriages taking place in that way. Now that's less than 1% of marriages in that year. You can, of course, have a separate ceremony. You can go to a register office or whatever and do that. Now, this is an area, of course, where there are many statistics banded around. The Law Commission said that they thought that 80% of Islamic marriages did not have a civil ceremony. I know from hearing other people within this room who may tell us later on that they would dispute that figure's that high, but even they would say that there is a substantial amount of marriages. Now, interestingly, that may be because people know that what I'm about to say about the implications of English law doesn't come into effect, or it may be because people don't realise that they're not married. And that, again, is something perhaps we can touch on later if you wish. If there's a problem regarding a religious divorce, that could be relevant in English divorce proceedings. It could be unreasonable conduct, unreasonable behaviour as it's called, to justify a divorce. The finalisation of legal divorce, again, this is one area where I'm afraid to say there are myths which are repeated. This was brought in about 2002, 2003 now, and as I said earlier, it gives you the ability to block the English divorce if there has not been a religious divorce. It was brought in, and at the moment, although various religions, any religion could be put forward to be included, only the Jewish faith is included. The Ministry of Justice, if you ask them the question as to why that is, they'll say they're the only faith who've asked us to do it. That is the response. And again, we can talk about it if you wish later on. Interestingly enough, religious marriage abroad, in a country recognising that marriage as legal, is recognised here. There is a very famous story from a few years ago of two sisters in Leicester. Muslim sisters, both married Muslim men. One went home to Bangladesh and got married in a mosque. One stayed in Leicester and got married in a mosque. Both the marriages sadly broke down. The woman who got married in a mosque in Leicester had no rights under English law for financial support. The one who was married in a mosque in Bangladesh did, which again kind of highlights the difference it requires. So, on that theme of financial support, you need to get a court order if you're going to have a financial order made by the courts. It needs to be by a court or an arbitrator, and there's a big difference here, and again this I think causes some confusion sometimes. If people are going to do things by consent, and indeed family law in England is very keen on autonomy of the parties, then an English court might well make that into a consent order. That's not an issue. That's what AINMT, which is actually a Jewish case, says. In fact the judge sent things off to the Beth Din in New York and it was settled and came back and then authorised. That's fine. However, if somebody is going to challenge what comes out of that process, let's say they no longer agree or they don't agree, the huge difference is that we now have in this country the IFLA, the International Family Law of Arbitrators, under English law, decide under English law, and the court is very likely to make that into a court order. That would not apply, for example, if it were the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal. So it's not the same, even though the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal sets up its rules on the back of the Arbitration Act. So there's a very big difference there. If you're not married, you can claim dowry as a matter of contract, and that's been there, as you can see from the slide here, you can see it for over 50 years following the case, that's a possibility. If you're not married, however, as I said, and I'm sure you know, you can't make application. And that is causing increasing problems. Without going into it, because I don't have the time, we have something called LASPO, legal aid has been taken away from people. More and more people do not know their legal rights and have no idea that this is the issue, let alone can do anything about it. So it's exacerbating an issue. Whether or not you're married depends on legal marriage. If you're legally married, you can claim property, income, capital, all those things. There's no automatic claim to a dowry as such under family law, but one thing as anyone in this room has done anything about English family law, it is very flexible. And there is, for example, a famous case which is called either AMT or MOT, where effectively the judge, this was a case, Iranian case originally, there was an unpaid dowry of £60,000 equivalent. And effectively the judge made a specific order under English law for payment, of in fact a lower amount actually, but very much based on the fact that that was payable rather than the dowry itself. So that flexibility is there. So, a few words by conclusion, I hope I'm within my time. The Law Commission reported last year, at the end in December last year, and they stressed the importance of recognising personhood. Baroness Barrett has explained that's a statement of something they have to say explicitly, but very much underline that as being important. I've mentioned the importance of autonomy. However, there is a qualification, and the qualification is the need to balance that principle against the need to protect the individual and the need to protect the state. The point about lesson from history is that it will be interesting to see what happens under English family law. There is a certain parallel, I think. In the late 1970s, situations were arising because you had a lot of non-Christian women who'd come into this country, emigrated to this country. They were then finding that their relationships broke down, their marriages broke down, they were being divorced in other countries, and they were having no financial relief. Now again, that not only left them in a terrible position, but of course it meant that they had to claim against the state. So it was impacting on the state because the state were having to provide benefits. So the law was changed. And for the first time from 1984, there was the ability to make a claim in an English court for financial relief, even if there had been a divorce abroad in certain circumstances. So as I've said, English law can be flexible if it perceives that there is an issue to address. And just two questions at the end. I mean, these are not new questions, they may have occurred to many of you. Those of you who are familiar with the Register Our Marriage campaigns are very much on par with that. But effectively, it would be interesting for people's views really, should there be changes so that all religions should be treated the same, irrespective of the religion? And should those married under a particular religion be treated the same wherever they get married? Those are the two questions I would leave you with. Thank you.
You won't be surprised to know that was exactly 8 minutes. Can I now call on Dr. Samia Barno to address us?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Siobhan. Whilst Siobhan is getting my slides, I'll just kickstart by thanking City Circle for the invitation and giving you some background to my research. Sorry, I'm a bit small for this. Okay, so the title of my paper is Muslim Marriage and Divorce Practices in Britain and English Family Law, Bridging the Unbridgeable, potentially. And I'll just give you some background. I did some research many years ago now on Sharia Councils. Myself and Sonia Shah-Kazmi were one of the first academics to do some research looking at the experiences of Muslim women and why they would choose to use religious councils, tribunals. And in particular, my research was very contextualised in exploring notions of identity and citizenship and multiculturalism, because I'm a little bit concerned about debates and how the debates are framed in relation to the practice of Muslim family law here, because often it's framed around very universal questions in terms of what is Islam, what is Islamic law, when actually the very local experience, very culturalized practice of Islam often gets lost in all of this. So some of the questions, so anyway, I've done some research and I published a book in 2012 on Muslim women and Sharia councils, but I'm going to talk about the new research that I'm doing at the moment with Muslim women's groups up and down the country and how they are redefining what Islamic law and Muslim family law means to them. And very much drawing upon Muslim feminist scholarship and drawing upon an intersectional framing to understand notions of identity, belonging and citizenship. So some of the questions that I'm looking at is to consider whether there is this unbridgeable abyss between women's rights, religious law and cultural norms in family matters. What are the limits of religious freedom and state interference? Questions of citizenship, identity and belonging, as I mentioned, are very important. The question of whether the state should facilitate religious and cultural state law practices is a very important one. I think Stuart Hall was one of the first sociologists to remind us that the state has never necessarily been a neutral arbiter of disputes, right? So for many minority ethnic groups, it's not as though historically the state has operated in an objective and neutral way. And a number of feminist organisations point to the fact that the state has been historically problematic in terms of how it's criminalised communities and groups too. And also looking at questions of coercion, consent, choice in family law matters. So I think I've got a lot of questions in this presentation. Okay, so very briefly, what is family law again? Muslim family law, I think there's a lot of complexity on the ground that's often being lost. There's a lot of debate on Sharia Councils. We don't really know what a Sharia Council is. We use this term, a Sharia Council, but there is no fixed definition. Those of us who have been working in this field for quite a few years know that the idea of a Sharia Council isn't something that's fixed and there. Sharia Council can be anything from being based in a mosque to being based in a front room of a local imam, right? It's not something that's fixed. So the idea and the interchangeable usage of language, I think, is problematic, from Sharia courts to Sharia councils to religious tribunals, is hugely problematic. And I think actually if the state wants to really deal with some of the problematics in terms of how it deals with what's going on in these private spaces, then we need to be very careful about language. And it's not, and I don't say this just as an academic, I think it feeds importantly on the ground too. So there's a complexity. Grant also talked about the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, and that's been going on for a couple of years. But Sharia Councils effectively came about because Muslim women wanted a Muslim divorce certificate. They argue it's user-based, so it's not as though they were set up because somehow they wanted to control Muslim communities, but it was a need for them. And I've done a lot of empirical research with them for my first book, and I'm doing some new research with these councils in terms of seeing if there's been any potential changes that I can talk about at the moment. But in terms of Muslim family law practices in Britain, for marriage practices, as we know, there's been a lot of debate in terms of Muslim marriage practices and what they are. What is the relationship between transnational marriages, forced marriages, local marriages? And the key questions are whether or not unregistered marriages and polygamy harm women, right, by allowing them to be treated as unequals. Does a ban on Muslim marriage practices violate the freedom of religion for those who freely choose to practice it? And what should be the role of the law in the practice of Sharia councils? Should we respect religious difference, even if it potentially harms Muslim women? Now, I've got this slide, I'm rushing through because I actually thought I had 20 minutes, but I was told I've got 8. So I am rushing through, but I can come back to some of these questions. Now, it's great that the government has now got 2 inquiries, right? It's like a bus, you wait and then 2 come along. And it's great that they've got these inquiries. Inevitably, there is some concern from women's groups, from Muslim women's groups, in terms of the parameters of the inquiries, in terms of what they're going to produce. I think those of us working in the field as academics, and I was also an activist for many years too, are concerned about the parameters and how these debates, reviews have how they've come about. But there has been also lots of interesting academic and social policy scholarship on the potential ways in which we can potentially accommodate religious practices in the UK. Martha Minow, Ayala Shaja and others have explored the idea of the ways in which we can actually potentially accommodate and the ways in which ethnic minority communities, and for us and our debate is Muslim communities, the way in which they're able to practice religious practices without there being issues of harm and coercion. Now, the problem with a lot of this research and a problem with a lot of the work on the ground is that it often doesn't engage with, I'm going to miss some of this out, I don't know how much time I've got, right, I've only got 3 minutes, I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to come back. I was going to look at what unregistered marriages and polygamy, but I've only got 3 minutes, so we're going to have to come back to that. I think the problem with a lot of the research and a lot of the debates is that it doesn't capture a Muslim subjectivity, and it continues to not do that because Muslim women's voices are often ignored in the key debates around Sharia councils, around unregistered Muslim marriages, and around debates of polygamy. And I think there's been lots of, and I'm doing some research with Muslim feminist scholarship, exploring how we can actually draw in the narratives of Muslim women, because Muslim women's voices have historically and continue to be ignored in these wider debates. So, for example, with the debates on Sharia councils, often Muslim women are spoken about as an ontological group rather than spoken to. So the Muslim women's voices tend to be ignored, and mine and the work of Sani Shah Ghazmi was the two only pieces of work, I think, that really started by exploring what were the voices of Muslim women. Now, I think it's important to bear in mind that when we say the voices of Muslim women, we also have to look at what these voices tell us, okay? So these voices can potentially say, look, I'm quite happy with the nikah, and I'm quite happy being in a polygamous marriage. And so therefore, we need to explore the ways in which, and I think this is where history, politics, and debates around multiculturalism are very important, because for many, many Muslim women that I've spoken to, and the research that we're doing is, myself and others are doing, is that these voices also need to be understood within the wider social or political context in which they're located. So issues of power, voice and authority don't just come about, but they come about in relation to other power relations, right? So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to understand unregistered marriage practices, it's not necessarily understanding it within the relation of autonomy, choice, and rational liberal choice, but it's also understanding the socio-political experiences in terms of their lived experiences, right? And I think that's very important in terms of how we can explore some of this. And I was going to very briefly, I'm going to come back to this, I'm drawing upon the work of Ziba Mir Husseini and others who are Muslim feminists. And they really are drawing upon a Muslim feminist critique of thinking through what Islam and Islamic law actually is, and actually and then challenging some of the personal narratives from Muslim women themselves on the ground. So rather than just accepting it in the liberal framework of, okay, Muslim women want an unregistered marriage, or Muslim women want a polygamous marriage, what you're trying to do is to explore the conditions upon which this may come without falling into the traps of coercion versus consent. Okay, I think I've really rushed by through all of that, but I'm so out of time.
Thank you very much.
So if I can now welcome Sir Mark Heatherly.
You haven't got anything to put up there for me, you'll be pleased to hear. I wear variety. The purpose of the Home Office review is quite a narrow remit in one sense, in that it is to look at the work of Sharia Councils, and in particular the question about whether they disadvantage women who use their services. You will appreciate, of course, that the Sunni community has councils, and as I'm saying, the Shia community doesn't, so that we immediately have two different areas straight away, but the fundamental focus is on councils. The group is chaired by Professor Mona Siddiqui. It has one family barrister, one family judge, one family solicitor on it, and two imams advising it, one from the Shia community, one from the Sunni community. He happens also to be a practicing solicitor. So it has quite a strong legal bias. There are two of us who are not Muslim, the rest are, at least by tradition. So that is where we're at, and the kind of work that we're trying to do at the moment. Fundamentally, a number of women's organisations have chosen to boycott and not communicate with us for various reasons that you may or may not have seen. In fact, quite a lot of Muslim women's organisations have engaged with us. A number of female users of councils with experiences, good and bad, have engaged with us, and we've had an opportunity to visit a number of Sharia Councils, see them in action, and talk to the scholars and the like, including those two councils that have female judges as well as male ones. So that's the kind of work that is going on at the moment. All our discussions are, of course, inevitably provisional at the moment, but I think there are some things that can most certainly be shared so that you have some idea of what's happening. Sharia Councils tell us that the focus of all their work is the question about whether a person is entitled to a religious divorce or not. Well, whether that is persuading the man to grant talaq, whether it is a khula, if I've got the pronunciation correct, or a fasq in the event of complete barriers being drawn up. So that they maintain is fundamentally their work. Councils that we've spoken to maintain that if people have got other issues they want to argue about, other than perhaps the return of dowry in the context of khula, they are directed to the civil authorities. Now, whether that accords with everybody's actual experience, of course, is a matter that's still under discussion. So, where have we got to? Well, I think one of the things that's impressed us is a completely unanimous view so far that the councils have an inevitable part to play because a religious divorce, even if you hold a decree absolute, is an essential, is seen by Muslim women as an essential thing to have. It amounts to permission to remarry within the community and so on. So I think that is one of the messages that we're receiving loud and clear. The second issue is there is a very delicate relationship with secular law. Everybody agrees that the state has a legitimate interest in marriage and divorce, and of course, because Islam is a minority community here, the secular law has a particular standing which is generally recognised. The matter is how you actually tie the two in together, and that's one of the matters that's exercising us. I think one of the keys will try to be to say, well, actually we ought to treat all religions the same. So, for example, we don't recognise Christian and Jewish marriages except when they conform with the Marriage Act 1949 and including the formalities required in that. And should that be true in relation to everybody who wants their marriage recognised and so on. And certainly one or two mosques have told us that they will not marry people unless they also contract a registered civil marriage, either at the same time because the mosque is able to do that, or prior to it, and those are issues that are presently under debate and that we need to be thinking about. Because when we're talking about treating all religions the same, it means that we've had to give some thought both to the practices of the Beth Din and the practices of the Roman Catholic Consistory Court in terms of its jurisdiction over annulments, and that's all part of the process that is being gone into, because it seems that it would be very difficult to act in relation to one without acting in relation to all. And so that matter is the subject of consideration at the present time. Can I just share with you briefly my two principal concerns in all this, which are completely unresolved. These are merely raising two issues that seem to be the subject of certainly anxious consideration for me at the moment. The first is, what is the true scope of the freedom to practice religion under Article 9 of the European Convention? Elizabeth, in opening, quoted the Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, Article 9.1 is drafted in identical language. But Article 9.1 is qualified by Article 9.2, which permits the state to interfere in certain circumstances with the freedom of religion. And I'll come to an example of that that concerns me in just a moment. And because it includes the right to observances and worship, therefore it includes the right, as I understand it, to practice religious marriage and divorce in the same way that Christians and Jews would claim for themselves the right to do. Well, there isn't a Christian concept of divorce, but that's left with the secular courts. But so there's a debate that is going on around that. And for example, I was conversing with not in the context of this inquiry, but a colleague and friend of mine who is female and Jewish and a judge, who was saying she'd be completely outraged if the state told her that she wasn't allowed to sit in the gallery during synagogue worship just because it created an atmosphere of inequality. That was the custom of their religion, that's what they wanted to do, and frankly it was nobody else's business whether they did or they didn't. Now it seems to me there is an element in which that kind of right has to be respected, but not at the entire cost of saying, well actually in that case, you know, people with an religion behave as they like towards the adherents of it. There's somewhere in there are balances which is not actually easy to identify or articulate. And those are some of the matters that cause me some concern at the moment. The second issue, which is really connected with this, is what is the role of the state in all this? Since the House of Commons, the House of Parliament seem to have set up their own inquiry, and the Home Office has got it. Presumably the state thinks it has got a role in these things. And the question is, what is it, if anything? in terms of this. Now, of course, the state has a legitimate interest in making sure that secular law is neither sidestepped nor undermined. And so that obviously is a legitimate aspect in which it's involved. One of the things that struck me is that pretty well all councils so far have acknowledged that there should be a much greater consistency of practice, there should be some internal regulation, there should be some issue about procedure, about the qualification of scholars who determine these matters and the like. But they also go on in the next breath to tell you that they can't deliver it because of the independence characteristic of the Sunni community, and therefore there isn't anyone with any authority over anybody else to make them do it. Now that raises, therefore, a significant problem, because if you have an acknowledgement that the whole thing needs regulating, and an acceptance that the community can't deliver the regulation, who does it? Is that where the state creeps in? And this, of course, is where Article 9.2 becomes relevant. Because what Article 9.2 says is freedom to perform one's religion or belief shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of public safety, for the protection of public order, health or morals, which is no doubt what the French government relies upon, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. So if in fact people's rights are being abused in the processes of the Sharia Councils, there is a legitimate basis in human rights law for state intervention. But if the state intervenes, what does it do about the Beth Din, who of course are in a much less strong position than the Sharia courts, because the Beth Din can't compel a man to give a get at the end of the day. Or the Roman Catholic Consistory Court, which is all administered from Rome anyway, and goodness knows what authority, if any, we could exert over that. And it does raise real problems if the state intervenes, in the sense that is it the role of the state to impose its own values on a religious community, let alone to enforce those values? And I think we actually are not clear at the moment where those arguments are ultimately going to lead us. But I share them with you so that you appreciate the kind of debate that is going on at the present time. I'm speaking purely personally. These are the issues that trouble me, and my colleagues may find they're all perfectly straightforward and what on earth is this man fussing about. But those are the issues that trouble me, and the ones that I'm wrestling with at the moment. So I shall stop there if I may.
Now welcome Sharia Councils here, OBE, to the stage.
I'd like to thank City Circle for inviting me to speak, and thank you, Siobhan, for contacting me last week, and I welcome the opportunity to share my views. What the report that was been mentioned is this, actually information and guidance on Muslim marriage and divorce in Britain. You can download that from the Muslim Women's Network website. If you go on to the top menu, resources and reports. Now, I'm not going to focus, this report actually talks about Sharia councils, it's got case studies, it talks about potential solutions as well. I'm not going to focus on the issues faced by Muslim women when they use Sharia councils, because it's all in there, you probably know anyway, things like forced to mediate, they'll go with a civil divorce and still be made to go through the process. It will be things around being pressured to give financial compensation to get out of a divorce, but being made to feel, to get a divorce, and being made to feel guilty actually for wanting a divorce. What I really want to focus on is the voices of Muslim women. I'm really worried that the voices of Muslim women in this debate are being marginalised and actually being hijacked by some parties as well. And in matters of faith, it's really, really important that Muslim women are heard. They are heard by everybody, and particularly by the two inquiries. Although I don't know why we need two inquiries. I think there's a bit of a competition going on about who can get their report out first. I don't know. So I feel that Muslim women are being used as a political football by various parties. And let me go into why. And right at the end, I'll talk about what it is that Muslim women want. And actually, they need to inform the solutions. This is about Muslim women and the issues they are facing, so they should also be informing the solutions as well, what works best for them, not what other people think that works best for them. Let me start with the government first. The government have launched this independent inquiry. We actually welcome that. Muslim women have been sitting around the table, going to the Ministry of Justice and talking about this issue for years. And so finally we have an inquiry, welcome it. The only issue is that it's been launched by the Home Office, kind of coming under prevent and counter extremism. It didn't need to be there. As Baroness pointed out earlier, there's lots of international human rights frameworks, CEDAW being one of them, and actually we've signed up to CEDAW, and in there's an article that talks about the government, because they've signed up to it, they should eliminate discrimination on issues of marriage and divorce. So therefore, the Ministry of Justice could have actually launched this inquiry, and it could have been done under CEDAW. So that's an issue there. And under the current political climate, it's not a good idea to put things like this and link it to prevent, because actually it'd be the Muslim women that will suffer in this climate when it comes to anti-Muslim prejudice, and it kind of might feed that a little bit. The other issue is the Sharia Councils. That's the other party as well. They want to exert their authority in the community, and not everyone has a bad experience. Some Muslim women have a positive experience from Sharia Councils, but some have awful experiences. And when they say, oh, look at these wonderful examples, I don't want them to focus on the wonderful examples. I want them to focus on the negative examples and figure out why it's happening. Why is it that you can go to the same Sharia Council and get good service and some get bad service? They need to look into why. Is it the panellists? Are some panellists more discriminatory than others? Or is it that when you go in and get a divorce, if the husband doesn't contest, you sail through the divorce and you don't get discriminated against. As soon as the husband starts contesting the divorce, that's when discrimination starts creeping in, because maybe the panellists start favouring the husband rather than the wife. So they need to look into this. The other issue is it's a business, it's a money-making business, right? And why is it that when Muslim women are going with a civil divorce, when if they have a recognised marriage, that they make the poor woman go through the process again and pay maybe up to £400 for that? They could, and actually Muslim countries, for example Pakistan, will actually recognise a civil divorce as an Islamic divorce. So why can't Sharia councils do that and spare the woman? They don't do that because it's a money-making business, and in most cases the civil divorce should count as Islamic divorce when if a man initiates the divorce, or if a woman initiates it and the man agrees to it, and where the judge has to rule. I think those cases aren't that common. But what they could say is, some women might say, well, I really want an Islamic divorce certificate. So they could say to the woman, well, we've seen your decree absolute, we've seen the paperwork, instead of charging you £400, we can charge you £40 and spare you through the process. But they don't do that. And actually there's lots of Sharia councils popping up, divorce services. They don't always call themselves Sharia councils all the time, and some of them are charging up to £600. And I have to say, some of them are quite dodgy. And I've given one example, I've sent one example through to the inquiry actually about a concern we have of somebody that has set up a Sharia council. So there needs to be some kind of oversight on this. Then I'm going to now finally deal with the activists, or not all activists, a group of what I would call anti-faith activists. I'll be even more specific, feminists. I'm a feminist myself, but I would say that I'm a faith-based feminist, so I want the best of all worlds, use human rights frameworks, I want to use civil law, but my faith is important to me. I know some people would like for Muslim women to leave their faith at home when they leave the front door. It's not a garment you take off, it's a part of you. So I feel that our voices are being hijacked. So I know Samarki was saying that Muslim women are boycotting your inquiry. I'd say actually it's anti-faith feminists, most of whom are not Muslim, and the very few Muslim voices, I would even go as far as saying they're very secular voices, and they're not representative of the Muslim women across the religious spectrum. Now, when I say this, people say, well, are you sort of saying they're not Muslim enough to represent Muslim women? No, I'm not saying that at all. Because if Sharia councils were wielding out very conservative Muslim women and saying they represent all of Muslim women, I would say the same to them. What the inquiries need to do is listen to all of the Muslim women across the religious spectrum, and Muslim Women's Network do that. When we wrote the report, we did that. We're consulting women right now across that religious spectrum. So it's really important that, and I did speak to Nusrat before she went, so I'm really worried that some people are going to hijack your inquiry. That worries me. It's only going to be one day of hearing evidence, and I know they're collecting the written evidence, but most people aren't even aware of the inquiry. More people are aware of the government independent inquiry. So I really worry about the findings of that inquiry, and it might be skewed to one side. So really the key message here is that Muslim women need to be listened to, and I don't feel that we are listened to. And you talked about Grant, you talked about the Jewish community have that when the judge can block the civil divorce until the religious divorce is granted. We actually did write a letter to the Ministry of Justice, and that was in May, saying actually we would like to discuss if that can also be an option. I think it needs a multi-pronged approach, and that could be one option. We were ignored. We were promised some meetings with the junior minister. It didn't happen, so I think we need to resubmit the letter now. Again, maybe we can get some support from others and resubmit that, I think, to the new minister. But I think the key thing has got to be, I think by just looking at Sharia Councils, you need to go to the actual heart of the issue, which is the marriage. Have civil marriages before you have a religious ceremony. That will probably solve a lot of issues. In the Muslim marriage contract, give women delegated right to divorce, so they don't need to be reliant on Sharia Council. So what Muslim women are saying to us is that, no, we don't want Sharia Councils banned right now, which might not be what people want to hear. What we want to do is for them to pull their socks up, raise their standards, but we also want the government to do something about this issue. We want civil laws strengthened, so Muslim women over the years are less reliant on Sharia Councils, and who knows, in the future they may be made redundant. So that's, really the Muslim women need to inform the debate. But very last thing that I want to finish off with is I'm really worried that Muslim women right now are being caught up between the Sharia Councils or the religious conservatives and anti-faith feminists, and that really worries me. And I want Muslim women to be heard. I want Muslim women to, on matters of faith, this is about them, I think they need to inform the solutions. So I think that yes, the inquiry should hear from everybody, but I think their voices actually do need to be prioritised. And I think the inquiries need to get out and see the service users, because they are not going to come to the inquiries. It will be the activists that will be giving, people like me, giving evidence to the inquiries. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaista, for that. And at this point, I just wanted to let you know that if you would like to stop to pray, this would be a convenient time for you to go and do that in the room next door. But because we are limited for time, we are going to proceed to the Q&A. So there's a microphone before Baroness Berridge, which we can use for the speakers, and there's a roaming mic. So if anybody has any questions at this point, yeah.
Thank you to the panel for the speeches. Thank you very much. My name is Islamuddin. I'm a PhD researcher researching Islamic divorce in the UK, and I'm a full-time imam as well. The question I have towards the whole panel really, with regards to researching and looking into these inquiries, I think we need to establish the figures, and I think Ron mentioned this in the beginning, about really how many marriages are unregistered, because the fact is there could be a play in the media here, as well as certain parties, to escalate the problem by just saying that there are so many unregistered marriages. And I think this is one of the statistics we want to establish firmly, rather than to take these anecdotal quotes and just react to these, because as a researcher myself, the figures that have been put about are really far too high. And I think generally when you look at the Muslim women in the UK, I think you will find that they do appreciate the different identities that they have, whether it be something which is linked to their citizenship, religion, ethnicity. I mean, they're able to juggle those. So I think what we need to do is firstly establish a reasonable figure, with some respect behind it, with some research behind it, with regards to the actual number of unregistered marriages. And I think, secondly, we need to understand how many women actually use Sharia Council as well. Because from my research, I found that women, they definitely want religious divorce, but not necessarily will they go to Sharia Councils. So this then brings in the equation, is it really women want to divorce by Sharia Council or by Sharia law, which are two different things altogether. And I can appreciate with the statistics that we hear from Sharia Council that they do a lot of cases, but in the scheme of things, and with my research, it shows that although they deal with a lot of cases, it's still a minority compared to the general Muslim community. So I think those two figures really need to be established for us to have some concrete debate, rather to have this sort of scaremongering going on in the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we do welcome comments from the audience, but if you could please keep them time limited. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned we would come back to it. Thank you. Right, you mentioned we'd come back to this a couple of times. I think it's quite an important issue to discuss. So with regards to the religious marriages and divorce, what potential pathways do you think there are for us to try and get to a position where Muslim nikah contracts are, or divorces rather, are put on hold, or rather, is it, whichever way it works? What are the pathways that you could potentially use? And this is something that you also mentioned, I still think that would be a useful discussion to have now, so that we can think about ways in which steps can be taken forward.
Sure. Well, I think it was very interesting to hear that, that a letter had been written. I mean, certainly that's the official line, that there's been no request. Obviously there was a letter written. I mean, it should not be a difficult thing. I mean, the issue, of course, is that there are people much better qualified here who are politicians and in government. I mean, it's never straightforward. It's not within the power of somebody who receives the letter to just do this. But the fact was that the law was brought in specifically to cover religions. It wasn't limited, although there was a particular issue in the Jewish community which it was sought to address, and of course that's why it was changed. But it was not limited to the Jewish community. And clearly, and even there, of course, to state perhaps the obvious, but I'll still say it, I mean, it is not, if you like, an ideal solution. I mean, you have situations where people, of course, get their decree absolute before the woman knows that she can block it, for example. But at least it's the ability. So I think it would be a question of making the formal request. I completely agree with you. I think the broader that request can be, the better, and publicising the point, because it is a clear distinction between the Jewish faith and every other religion.
In fact, yeah, probably could probably hear me. I've got big mouth. In fact, not only did we write a letter, but it's actually in here as well as a recommendation. So we're going to try again. So let's hope we get heard this time round. Just wanted to come to Islam. A couple of comments that you made in terms of the statistics. I think 80% is too high, and then when that 80% figure is bandied around, it's bandied around without any kind of reason for how that 80% has been arrived at. I feel, and I'll say why I feel this, that it's probably more at 40%. We need to remember it's not just about people not having or having a civil marriage. You also have spouses from abroad, and if they've come on a spousal visa, their marriages will be recognised in this country. So what we've started to do is analyse, and actually out of our 39 different inquiries that we have on the helpline, marriage and divorce is in the top 5. So we're trying to now analyse, so we'd ask them, so do you have a legally recognised marriage, and we question them. And so we're trying to now collect statistics. And at the moment, our statistics, so we haven't got a big body of statistics, so we're getting around 40% that are not in registered marriages or legally recognised marriages. And that kind of matches up with stats from the Birmingham Council Mosques. I think they are also asking the question, and they work very independently from us. In fact, we've fallen out with each other, so we're not sharing our statistics with each other. So they're coming up with very similar statistics as well. So perhaps it's more around about 40% mark. I agree with you when you talk about it's not just Sharia councils giving a divorce. Women that come to us are going to individual imams and scholars. They're going to mosques as well. And these are little Sharia councils that are popping up, don't even call themselves Sharia councils. But when you look at the 2 inquiries, they keep talking about Sharia councils. So when they have these recommendations, it's going to miss out a whole load of people. In fact, what will end up happening is people will just go and start using these other services, and you might get more underground divorce services, and actually it will be less transparent and more discrimination.
Can I just add to what Nara said, and Grant, in terms of this piece of legislation, because when a few of us started to do this research, and we kick-started it around 2002, 2003, so there's been a lot of work done on the ground. A number of community organisations did actually look at this piece of legislation, so it's not as though it's been ignored by the Muslim community. The fundamental difference was, and why we don't have Muslim cases, is that, sorry, it's not working anymore, is that under Islam, women do have access to divorce. You don't under Jewish law, right? That was the fundamental difference. Now, then that raises the question of how you can make it potentially compatible to make this piece of legislation effective. But then you also need to then look at Islamic law. Then the question of what Sir Mark Cody was saying in terms of what is Islamic law, right? What is Islamic marriage becomes really important, because if you're then going to use state law legislation to then make Islamic law quite fixed in terms of this is what divorce is, this is how it's invoked, then it raises the question of complexity, right, in terms of what is being practiced on the ground. So then the relationship between state law and cultural practices, which are religious cultural practices on the ground, don't necessarily match. And I think a lot of Muslim organizations, when I started doing the research, that is why there was a fundamental difference of why Muslim communities never needed to use the legislation, whereas under Jewish law, you had to use the legislation. So I think it's an area where, okay, you can talk about it's a potential looking at, but in practice, it's going to be really difficult, and that's the primary reason. But in terms of, I think you're absolutely right about the research and numbers, and then how those numbers get fed into debates of polygamy and unregistered marriages, and somehow, Muslim communities are becoming exceptionalized. But let's not also forget that there are Muslim couples who choose not to register their marriages. There are educated, professional, that are couples, who are wanting to use that you have to be educated and somehow to have consent, right? That choose not to do this. And I have friends and family who they're barristers, human rights barristers, and they've chosen just to have the niqab. So you've got to also be careful about exceptionalizing a community, because as a family lawyer, what I know is that what research tells us around cohabitation and couples and reasons for cohabiting, that many women cohabiting relationships would say that, well, I'd love him to propose and we'd like to get married, but he doesn't want to commit. So then exceptionalizing communities to say, okay, you have to potentially register, raises lots of important questions. But I absolutely agree with you, Shaista, that it has to be based on the spectrum of vulnerability and harm and coercion. But then you have to be careful if you're going to make it apply, then you have to also make sure that the Law Commission's proposals of strengthening cohabitation rights are also put into play, that it doesn't then just become something about religious communities and that somehow they don't have autonomy.
Sorry, just 1 moment. Sorry, Sir Mark, and then I'll come on to Spencer.
Can I just say two things? One is, one possibility, of course, is treating Islam exactly the same as the other religions, which is to say no imam may perform a marriage unless it complies with the 1949 Act. And the Christian and Jewish religious people commit an offence if they go through a ceremony of marriage which does not, the parties don't, but the minister does, commits an offence if he goes through a ceremony of marriage, or she, which doesn't comply with the Act. That's one possibility, so as to tie the two together, which means that people who want a nikah without a civil marriage will have to do without an imam as well. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, of course, is saying that the Sharia Council shouldn't deal with divorce unless and until the civil proceedings have been concluded. And of course, if most marriages are registered and therefore there are civil proceedings, there should be a very significantly diminishing need for Sharia Councils, except for people who've opted out of the system altogether, which frankly is their business.
Yeah, just in terms of the issue around, blocking the civil divorce until the religious divorce is granted, I agree that, Muslim women do have a route, they can actually get a divorce, but I think it would be still useful to have, because what's also we're finding is that some husbands are trying to negotiate a better civil divorce settlement in return for a religious divorce. So I think it does have its use for some women, but again, we need a multi-pronged approach. It's not going to work for everybody. And I think the other issue around lost my train of thought now. What did you? What
choice?
Oh yes, cohabitation. I think there is a difference, because when you're cohabiting, you're not married. You're cohabiting, but when you actually do a nikah, you're saying I am married to you. And that obviously is a massive commitment. You're saying, I am married to you in Islamic law, and that is a marriage. But then you're saying, I want to commit to you, but I don't really want to have those other commitments should that union break down.
Which has
and most women, and I know career women who are deliberately doing it.
I'm not saying that they are married, so
Yeah.
they will want to keep it private.
But the vast majority, a lot of women though that are coming onto the helpline, they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
So it's the husband's family who don't want it, don't want the civil marriage, or the husband doesn't want the civil marriage. So we've got to think about protecting those women. And they say, do you know what, we'd love it if actually they had no choice, because when we start saying we want a civil marriage, we're worried that we might lose that option to get married.
Yeah. Sorry, we're going to have to serve the refreshments because we have the room until 8 o'clock. So if I can take one final burning question. That's one. The gentleman had his hand up, and then we'll have refreshments.
I hope it meets expectation. It was more sort of two comments really. I don't need that, thank you. It was, first of all, far be it for me to sort of lecture on what Islamic law is, but you don't need an imam to conduct a marriage. And I'm bemused that government seem to think that we should encourage the Islamic community to register mosques. Mosques are not the preferred place for marriages to take place. So it's not any wonder that there are only 22, Mr. Howell, you said, in the law conference. I mean, of course there are only 22. I mean, it's not really the place that people are going to get married. I mean, I think that the whole of, the Marriage Act of 1949 is massively out of date. The Law Commission said it's totally out of date. I would go as far as saying it's not fit for purpose. I mean, it really needs to be rewritten from the ground up, and I agree. I mean, I think that there are slight issues with putting a married couple into the bracket of cohabitees. I mean, cohabitation is, when does cohabitation start? There's no defined entry point. You know, to quote Ormrod, as he was then in the case of Colette, if a marriage ceremony takes place in England and Wales, and it is a ceremony, it should be held valid. And then we should worry about the sort of how we get there in a different way. I think at the moment I agree with everything that's been said. This figure that's been bandied about, and if there's a reference actually to the law com, I don't think the law com mentioned it as 80%.
No, I think they said it was anecdotal.
Anecdotal. I sort of was horrified when I heard that, but I think I misheard. It's around 30 or 40%. My research shows that it's 30%. Your research shows it's 30%. Shah Kamezi says it's 27%. This figure, we need to just move away. Last year, I really enjoyed your article in The Guardian. Last year, it came from the back of the two articles in The Times about Sharia marriages. I took such offence to that label being applied, that these are Sharia marriages. Now they're being called illegal marriages and things like that. There are so many issues that we need to talk about, and I'm going 100 miles an hour, but it's, we'll talk offline.
We are going to have time to have refreshments, and if I can just briefly conclude to thank everybody for coming this evening so late. We have the room until 8. But just really one tiny issue that Shabana and I have been talking about is that actually unregistered marriages are actually seen as valid in UK law for the purpose of forced marriage. Religious marriages have crept into the definition of marriage from the Civil Protection Prohibition Order into the criminal law. It's something I cannot remember. I raised, if you do, they work from you.com. I did raise it in the context of legislation, and the government minister's response to the dispatch box, despite having obviously on most of this, was all over the place about this, because actually now, and I'm looking with Shabana and I can talk about whether there's a possibility to raise this again, that in that situation you can now, it appears under UK law, have a conviction against usually the husband, not always, usually the husband, who can then be in prison for forced marriage, and you are in a religious marriage, but you cannot walk across the court to the family court and get any kind of financial relief. And I think we're just waiting for the first case where this woman has a conviction and cannot then get any redress. So we're trying to see whether there is a way on that very narrow basis to start wedging in on this, because that's very, very unjust. Thank you all for coming. Sorry that I haven't been able to give more time, but we do need to have refreshments so that we can be at 8 o'clock. So thank you, Siobhan. It's been a real privilege to host you here this evening, and thank you all so much for coming. I do hope you'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Can we just have another round of applause for the speakers who kindly agreed to volunteer their evening for us tonight?